So I want to remind you that although we've started to talk about realism, and realism will become really the predominant approach of artists in France, in particular in other countries of Western Europe in the 19th century, that you still have the importance of classicism, of academic classicism, and the predominance of romanticism still in many countries that really continues for at least half of the 19th century. And that what we saw on Monday in terms of what we define as the Romantic movement in Germany is a movement that very much was promoted by the Napoleonic invasions, the desire for a nationalistic identity and a nationalistic state, and most importantly, that German artists perceived a situation of opposition between basically who they were and who they thought of themselves as in comparison to Mediterranean countries and artists of a different tradition. And so we have German artists seeing a contradiction and opposition between classical Mediterranean pagan tradition and Northern Gothic spiritual or Christian tradition. And that this duality is reflected very much in the painting of the period. And the two prominent German artists whom we looked at, whose works were very much in opposition in terms of their landscape painting to the work of another German, Joseph Anton Koch, are works that very much are dealing with the idea of nature as a kind of spiritual inspiration, of landscape as having explicitly or suggestively a spiritual meaning and a spiritual side. And we looked at both Friedrich and Runge, two extraordinary German Romantic artists. I want to move on now to talk about another very interesting group of German painters. We're going to look at them just very briefly, but I think to kind of bring the ideas that we've talked about in terms of German Romantic painter to conclusion. In the early 19th century, in 1809, a number of dissatisfied students at the Vienna Academy, Vienna, established what they called was a brotherhood of St. Luke. Now, St. Luke, in the tradition of art and art history, and in Christian tradition, was said not only to have been an apostle, but he was also, among other things, an artist. And so it's very common throughout the history of artist guilds and artist associations, particularly of painters, to associate themselves with St. Luke. The organization of these young students was dedicated to criticism, but also to encouragement in terms of what they were attempting to do in their painting. They were very much opposed to the academic classical tradition, which again in many ways they saw as allied with a kind of Mediterranean pagan tradition. They were unhappy about the kinds of imposed subject matter that was required as they learned academic traditions and academic techniques. These young artists, however, did admire certain Italian artists, so the Mediterranean world was not fully exiled. For instance, they admired the work of Pietro Perugino, an artist who, by the way, was the teacher of Raphael Sanzio, and then Raphael himself, because they saw these artists as having a kind of true understanding of the function of painting. They were particularly interested, though, in German painters of the Renaissance, including Albrecht Dürer. You know the name Dürer, D-U-R-E-R. Because they were interested in the German Renaissance perspective, which to them was more flattened, more two-dimensional. And they were attracted to that kind of art because they claimed they wanted to achieve a kind of purity and chastity and medieval approach to painting that would express Christian truth. In fact, they believed devoutly that painting was essentially Christian and spiritual, and that sculpture was essentially pagan and physical. And you can see how you just think of those two media, and you could set up that kind of dichotomy. There was also, of course, the political sensibility here. Vienna had been occupied by Napoleon's troops in the early 19th century. So again, this movement toward an authentic German art is something that these young painters are wrestling with. Their involvement with the spirituality of the past led them eventually to, ironically, leave Vienna. And in 1810, they established a Christian brotherhood in Rome, where they lived in monk-like seclusion, grew their hair long, wore what they considered to be ancient or medieval dress, and they call themselves the Nazarenes, Nazarenes, the Nazarenes. Who was the original Nazarene? Jesus, yes, Jesus of Nazareth. So they name themselves for that location. Nearly all of them, interestingly enough, converted to Catholicism. The two leading artists of the group were Franz Forr, Pforr, and Friedrich Overbeck. So here you have both of those names for you to see the spelling, because this is a portrait of Franz Forr by Friedrich Overbeck, and the date is 1810. Overbeck painted this work soon after the arrival of the Nazarenes in Rome. He shows Forr resting his arm on a window sill with another window in the background, so we're sort of looking through a room. And what we're seeing in the background is a Gothic town. You can see the Gothic style of architecture. So we're very much referencing that Gothic tradition and that spiritual tradition that is associated with the Gothic style. Attributes help to identify the meaning. Besides the painter is a domestic cat, perhaps a reference to the woman whom we see in the background, who, like Mary, if you think about, potential symbolism here, is busy. She is reading. She appears to be sewing as well, a sign of a virtuous woman. There's also, as in representations of Mary in an Annunciation, a jar of white lilies here, again for reference to her chastity. There's also a domesticated falcon up above. So there are all kinds of sort of medieval style symbols here, and some very specific Christian religious symbols, including the grapes for Holy Communion, for the wine of Holy Communion. And then you'll also have some elements down below on the sill which seem to make specific reference perhaps to Franz Forr's own personal family crest or emblem. And then, importantly, a kind of memento mori, that is a skull with a cross. Memento mori, is that a term we've used before? M-E-M-E-N-T-O, memento. So what's a memento? A token of something, sorry, yeah.
Yeah, something to remember by.
Yeah, something to remember something by. Mori is death. So a cross and a skull are very commonly used iconographically in art to remind us that we have a finite existence. So this is very much meant to be a work that speaks to us about Christianity and Christian tradition. Overbeck has modeled his painting style and his composition to some extent on his admiration for the German painter Albrecht Dürer, whom I named just a few minutes ago. I show you, for instance, a self-portrait by Dürer from 1493. Dürer had created, in fact, a number of self-portraits which could have been known to these artists. Franz Foer's representation shows him wearing a very conservative, almost medieval-looking style of dress, perhaps a reference to Dürer. And there's a very strong sense here, despite the fact that they were dissatisfied with the subject matter that was taught to them in school in Vienna, there's a very strong sense of an artist who was trained in an academic tradition. Strong contour, understanding of color, control, and use of line here. And one gets that sense that he understood that kind of naturalism or realism was found in Dürer as well. In 1810, Foer and Overbeck agreed to paint a work on the theme of friendship. So this is Overbeck's work, not finished for several years, as you notice, a long period of time, 1811 to 1828. And that's because Franz Foer died in about the same period of time, a very young age. Overbeck was overwhelmed by the death of his friend. He stopped painting for a while, and then he continued on, as you can see, working on this piece for quite a period of time. It's called Italia et Germania. What does that translate to? Italy and Germany, yes, 1811 to 1828. Here, Italy and Germany, the two countries, are personified, represented as two young women. Germany is blonde with a mountain landscape and Gothic buildings. Italy is a dark-haired young woman in front of a view of the Roman Campagna. This painting, in essence, is trying for Overbeck to represent a kind of reconciliation of Nazarene ideas, that they were heirs to a spiritual, medieval Rome of the Middle Ages, and to a Germany of that same spiritual period, and that they wanted the two to come together as an original kind of painting. But again, stylistically, there's very clear academic approach to the representation of form, although there is a kind of celebration of color here. Over time, a number of other artists joined the Nazarene group and continued working in a technique or style that is very linear, very crisp, and ultimately very obvious and didactic. And what I mean by that is you can kind of tell that this is called Italia and Germania, and they're supposed to be friends, yes? So that's what you get in terms of Nazarene art, which continues, by the way, to be important as an organized group, and is ultimately very influential on Bible illustration in the 19th century. Any questions? So having looked at an overview of German Romantic painting, I want to turn now to England and the two great English Romantic painters of the 19th century, Joseph Mallord, William Turner, and John Constable. And as with German Romantic painters, it will be interesting to see that landscape continues to be the avenue by which these Romantic painters will develop and express the Romantic movement. The great age of English painting begins with the establishment of the Royal Academy of London. We're moving back in time now, 1700. 1768, with a charter and money given by the king, King George III. So as in France, a little bit earlier on, the desire, of course, is to have a stable of artists who can produce the requisite portraits and works that represent the character of English life and English art. I'm showing you here a self-portrait by the artist Joshua Reynolds, the first president of the Royal Academy of London. He served from 1768 until 1791. There is a famous Reynolds portrait in the Huntington. Which one is it? Okay, well, I'll let you find it when you go over there to work on the extra credit. Reynolds was a supporter of classical idealization, and he thought of the idealization of form, which was taught, of course, as we know, in the French Academy, to be the appropriate approach and superior to anything that was particularized or realistic. Each year, as president of the Royal Academy of London, he lectured to students who were training in the fine arts, stressing again classicism, learning to draw, learning how to model, learning how to control color, and studying the great masters of the past. It's almost the curriculum that we remember from the French Academy. The Royal Academy was different in a number of ways. One way was that it limited membership to 40 masters, 40 academicians. That literally meant that if you wanted to be a master, somebody had to die, right? And the academy was governed by an elected council of 8. Women were excluded from membership, but they could exhibit in the academy exhibition, which was just as important, you might imagine, as the official arm of the Royal Academy of London, was just as important as the Salon in France. So setting us up then for a kind of similar conservative state of the arts, beginning in the 18th and moving into the 19th centuries, I want to show you the work of an extraordinary artist who is very far outside of what we have just been talking about, and that's the artist William Blake, considered a precursor of the Romantic movement in England. He hated Joshua Reynolds. He despised the curriculum of the academy, although he had studied there for a short period of time as a student of engraving. Blake was a very unique individual who from childhood had some very different kinds of experiences that ultimately would temper his art and his style. At the age of 4, he tells us, he saw God looking at him through a window of his house. Another time, he said, he saw angels in a tree, and the prophet Ezekiel appeared to him. This is what we would describe as a kind of mystic, someone who perceives things very differently. His early training was in drawing and printmaking, and in 1784 he opened a print shop with his brother Robert. His brother died about 3 years later, and Blake told a story that he was with his brother Robert when he died, and he saw his brother's soul leave his body and go up through the ceiling. Again, these are the accounts of a mystical, very unique individual. You may already be familiar with Blake as a poet. If you've ever read any English Romantic poetry, it's among the most beautiful poetry ever written. In 1789, he issued 19 of his poems in an illustrated volume called The Songs of Innocence. They dealt with the innocence of the child. And in 1794, subsequently, he followed up the earlier series with what he called The Songs of Experience. So I want you to notice that date, 1789. Does that ring a bell in Europe? 1789, beginning of the modern era. Someone help me here. Yes? The French Revolution. Yes, the French Revolution. So, and in 1793, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette lost their heads. So we've got two works that sort of, are bookends to either side of that historical period in France. Blake's drawing style was very unique, first of all, because he was not interested in imitating an academic classical tradition, but he also had a very unique approach in that he engraved both the text and the illustration on one plate. So he didn't separate the two. He didn't make the illustration a separate plate and then actually create the text. They were both part of one plate. In contrast to his famous poem in the Songs of Innocence, which perhaps you have heard before, Little Lamb, who made thee? Dost thou know who made thee? The most famous poem of William Blake is perhaps from the Songs of Experience, about a tiger. If you've never heard it or read the whole thing, it is really an extraordinary poem. Just a little bit of it here, not the whole thing. Tiger, tiger, burning bright in the forest of the night, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry? And what shoulder and what art could twist the sinews of thy heart? And when thy heart began to beat, what dread hands and what dread feet? When the stars threw down their spears and watered heaven with their tears, did he smile his work to see? Did he who made the lamb make thee? So this is a question about God and, the existence of all of nature. A poem of doubt and a poem of condemnation. Because as I pointed out to you, the Songs of Innocence and the Songs of Experience really bridge a very challenging period in terms of the French Revolution, the bloodiest period of time. The ideals of the French Revolution were ideals that many Englishmen supported. After all, they had this crazy king. And they were unhappy with monarchy as well. So there was great sympathy to the idea of republicanism. But many Englishmen reconsidered when the revolution turned to outright massacre and terror, as it did, of course, in the 1790s. As early as 1824, Blake was approached by the painter John Linnell, Linnell, who was responsible for that portrait of Blake that we saw at the beginning, Linnell, to do a series of engraved illustrations of the Divine Comedy, the great work of the medieval Italian poet Dante Alighieri, which we've actually talked about before. Dante was a medieval Italian poet and philosopher born in Florence who wrote the Divine Comedy in the early 14th century. A great poem that describes his vision of the three realms of the world to come: hell, purgatory, and paradise. It's very much then a dramatic story of Christian belief. And it's also a personal vision of this extraordinary poet, Dante, who believes in Christian salvation. And ultimately, in the Divine Comedy, he does see the essence of God, but he starts in the lowest rungs of hell and suffers there until he begins a journey that ultimately takes him to understand the essence of God. This is sort of the perfect work for a romantic artist to attempt to illustrate, again, because of its mystical elements. I'm showing you here an image of Dante Alighieri as William Blake would have imagined him. What I hope you notice here is, although he didn't really know what Dante looked like, it's an extraordinary work that indicates that the degree of his ability, if he chooses, to create a very naturalistic-looking portrait. Like a number of artists of the Romantic period, Blake found the Divine Comedy essentially extraordinarily inspirational. And in particular, he loved the stories that happened in the Inferno, in hell. And those, in fact, became the largest number of illustrations that he worked on. Heaven, I suppose, was a little boring. And I don't write that down. But the fact is, hell was tremendously interesting in terms of the characters whom Dante would meet. What you're looking at here is one of the watercolor drawings that Blake did to illustrate the very beginning of the Divine Comedy, in which this is the Inferno, chapter 1. Dante is running from 3 beasts. Throughout most of the journey through hell, into purgatory, and then into paradise, Dante is accompanied by the ancient poet Virgil. Virgil is commonly said to represent reason, whereas Dante is pure passion. So they complement each other. And traditionally, Virgil is shown wearing blue and Dante is shown wearing red. Color was highly significant for Blake, who had his own ideas about the significance and meaning of colors. This is not unusual. Many artists throughout the history of art have felt very strongly about the function and meaning of particular colors. So the poem begins with Dante, who is lost in a forest, symbolizing what he felt was his life, his unworthy life, a forest filled with evil, filled with elements that would choose to destroy you, obviously represented by these 3 beasts that we see represented in Blake's watercolor. Throughout the series, we're going to see these highly inventive illustrations that are specifically derived from William Blake's readings of the Divine Comedy and trying to capture the essence of each of the different episodes and to interpret them in his own way. Here we are. This is King Minos in hell. You can see on the left-hand side Virgil leading Dante up, trying to speak to King Minos. And then you can see the flames of hell and the people who are suffering, twirling around in hell in what's referred to as the second circle of hell from the Inferno in Dante's Divine Comedy. Purgatory is represented in a very few watercolor drawings. This is actually, and it's extraordinarily modern looking here for something from 1824. It's just sort of down to its essence here. There's an old angel who guards the entrance to purgatory, and so you can see Dante and Virgil are approaching, and they're going to have some intercourse with this angel in order to gain access to the 7 terraces of purgatory. I'm just showing you a few of the watercolors, which are quite extraordinary. And finally, Paradise, which, as I said, is the smallest number of watercolors or sketches. Here, Dante is shown among saintly figures. He now has a new guide, a woman named Beatrice. So a symbol, certainly, of fulfillment, a symbol of the goodness of the Virgin Mary. Again, a very personal interpretation of the 14th century poem. Blake never finished this project. He left 102 designs in various states of completion, from pencil sketches to some of the watercolors that we've looked at. His health was poor. He died in August of 1827, and he was poor and he was relatively obscure. He was found propped up in bed, dead, with some drawings around him. There are only 7 engravings measuring about 9.5 by 13 inches that were ultimately created from the series of drawings and watercolors. And remember, this was to have been a series of engravings to illustrate the entire Divine Comedy. The Circle of the Lustful, or also called the Whirlwind of Lovers, is the only engraving of the 7 that were projected to have been completely finished. It's really tragic in terms of how little survives, but how great what does survive is. Blake has created in this illustration, again, a unique interpretation of a specific event that took place where else but in hell. His lack of very much formal training, his disdain for classical academic drawing, the fact that he probably had not drawn from the nude very often or very much, led him to produce a figural style and a kind of representation that is clearly stylistically his own. It's a composition that's brilliant, that's filled with energy. It's sort of like a Goya. You're not so concerned about what might be missing, but you are struck by what is there in terms of the print. In this particular engraving, Blake is telling us the story recounted by Dante of Francesca, the daughter of Guido Vecchio de Polenta of Ravenna. To make a long story short, Francesca de Rimini had been married off to the disfigured, mean brother of a family in Rimini, near Ravenna. And she hated her husband, but she did her duty as wife. And one day the husband was gone, and the younger brother, whose name was Paolo, came in to speak with her, and she had been reading the story of in romance of Queen Guinevere and Lancelot, and she started to tell him about it, and he sat down with her, and they started reading it together. It's a love story. And then one thing led to another, and then Guido, the disgusting husband, came home, and that was the end of that. What happened was adultery, which was forbidden by the church. And the punishment was that Francesca and Paolo were condemned to hell to be tortured by being in a whirlwind, seeing each other constantly and unable to ever touch each other again. And so this is what we see, and it seems to have been an issue for a number of lovers because we see an entire whirlwind of lovers who have been condemned throughout eternity because of the sin of adultery. It's an extraordinary work. We are told that Dante himself was so overwhelmed when they stopped for a moment to tell him their story that he fainted. And so you see he's collapsed and Virgil is looking at him. What we're seeing is a work that is emphasizing overall, stylistically and in the subject matter chosen, passion. And that we know is one of the basic definitions of a romantic work of art. This is the ultimate of passion. This is a sort of sublime experience of passion, and it's exalting the spirit of the imagination as well. This is very far removed from any concept that one might have of realism as it begins to develop in the 19th century. Blake, however, was very much in opposition to more rationalistic foundations. The Age of Reason, actually, is one of the ways that we refer to the 18th century. It's also called the Age of Enlightenment. But in England in the 19th century, more and more we're going to see both Romanticism and, to some extent, realism. And both of these develop in part because of the changes taking place in society at that time. The Industrial Revolution is going to have very dramatic consequences for populations in Western Europe in the 19th century. Between 1750 and 1850, a 100-year period that I have actually brought up before, but here I reference England. England became the richest and most powerful nation on earth. Although she had lost her colonies, she held Canada, India, Australia, other places throughout the world, and her domination of world trade was quite remarkable, exceedingly profitable. And much of this is fueled by, and in turn helps to fuel, the Industrial Revolution. English Romantic art of the 19th century tends toward the personal, as we've seen with William Blake. Mainstream painting concentrates in the first half of the century on landscape. And the two greatest landscape painters of this period are John Constable and J.M.W. Turner. And I want to begin with John Constable. The 19th century was a period of tremendous transition for the English, certainly in terms of rule, although one could say there was a stability in government because kingship, of course, continues in England where it does not in France, ultimately, in the 19th century. So both John Constable and J.M.W. Turner lived from the reign of George III, his profligate son, George IV, then his brother, who wasn't much better, William IV, who had no children who could accede to the throne, and so his niece becomes queen. And who is this niece who becomes queen? You know, all we think of is Elizabeth, who has reigned for 60 years now. Queen Victoria ruled even longer than that. Yes, from 1837 to 1901. This is a self-portrait, a drawing by John Constable from 1806. Constable was one of 6 children born and reared in the English countryside. He was a man who loved the English landscape and the country. He attended classes at the Royal Academy. He eventually became an associate of the Royal Academy, and he exhibited regularly. He was not, however, elected to the Royal Academy as an academician until 1829. He died in 1837, so he had worked for a very long time to become an academician. He had exhibited for at least 26 years. What this indicates to us is that his work, although acceptable, was not highly regarded by his contemporaries, and even though we think of him as one of the great English painters of the 19th century, there were some issues as far as the establishment was concerned. One reason for all of this was that his very best landscapes tended to be anti-classical. I mean, I've already characterized him as an English Romantic painter. He painted more rustic, picturesque scenes, pastoral scenes, a lot of cows. And remember that the pastoral landscape, the rustic landscape, is a lower classification in terms of landscape painting. His landscapes, although extraordinarily and beautifully painted, were found to be somewhat crude to the discerning English who preferred the classical landscape. And whenever I say classical landscape, you need to think of Joseph Anton Koch, right? So even though he was German, we're using his work, Landscape with Rainbow, as our key to looking at other landscapes of the 19th century. He received an allowance from his father, who was a miller, so someone who worked on the land. He often had to support himself by painting portraits because he couldn't make money with his landscapes. His love was landscape, but he couldn't sell a major work other than to his family until he was 39, almost 40 years old. And again, this is one of these things where I have to tell you, willing suspension of disbelief. You're just going to have to believe me, because when you look at this work of Malvern Hall, this extraordinarily beautiful landscape painting, you think, well, my gosh, what do they want from him? This shows someone who very much understands the tradition of classical landscape, as taught at the Royal Academy. Perfectly balanced composition, an expanse of land viewed across a lake with incredible perception of light, reflection. He's moved in screening elements and screening devices. He's moving our eyes into the background. This is everything that we thought a classical landscape painter should do. And yet it's a work that's also, interestingly enough, very precise in terms of the atmosphere and the weather on this particular day. So it's not idealized enough. It's a typically wet English weather landscape. And that's something that Constable always felt was important. He wrote notes on weather and on times of day, on sketches that he did prior to finishing his works in the studio. It was very important to him that he remember the exact quality of the light and that he try to represent it in his paintings. Remember, these artists are still not painting en plein air, right? They are not painting out of doors. They're coming into the studio. But he did sketches. He made notes so that when he came back, he could recreate what he had seen. This is a work called The Stour Valley, Dedham Church. The date is 1814. Because of his family ties, that his family, in fact, were people who worked the land. As I said, his father was a miller. Constable generally painted places with which he was very familiar. This was a favorite area, the Stour Valley, and especially a place called Dedham, or Dedham Vale. A vale, V-A-L-E, is a kind of low-lying valley. It was very rich in farming, as you can see, crisscrossed by streams. There were lakes. A very rich agricultural region north and east of London. Now, I remind you that the great artists of the 18th and 19th centuries traveled, and specifically it was thought one needed to go to Italy to see a very different kind of countryside. Constable did travel, but his exotic locales were always in England. He did not travel to distant places. He was absolutely consumed with the picturesque regions of the Stour Valley, and he spent late summers and autumns traveling in the region, in the springtime as well, making sketches, and then working on finished paintings in his studio during the winter time for coming exhibitions. He painted many landscapes, again, with very rustic kinds of scenes, so that here in the Stour Valley Dedham Church painting, there's a very strong emphasis on the plowed land and fields, on a farmer's cart here. Let me get a little bit closer so you can see some of the detail, which is kind of dark as it's being projected. But here, fixing the wagon, digging something out. There's a dog or two by the side of the wagon. We see two workhorses shown as well. For Constable, this was the essence of England. Landscapes with those who work the land, landscapes with plowing scenes. He loved representing the agricultural lands and production represented in the English countryside. And there is a strong literary and pictorial tradition in England at this time that sort of celebrates this, because what we're seeing is, in a way, the passing of a time, because the Industrial Revolution is going to change things very dramatically in England. And so we're looking at a kind of idealized, romanticized version of life in England before all of that is going to change. It is said that in works such as this one, Constable anticipated many of the theories of the later French Impressionists. And that is also evident in perhaps his most famous work called The Hay Wain. About 4 years ago at the Huntington, they had a Constable show, and they brought some of his largest landscapes. These are called the 6-footers. This is actually a 6-footer that we're looking at. And they are so incredibly impressive to see in person. No illustration, especially something that's projected as dark as this one, does it justice. Because Constable had a kind of analytical mind. I said he made sketches, he drew, did watercolor, he took down information and observations of the weather conditions. He did sketches of cloud formations. He annotated pretty much everything so that he would, as far as he was concerned, capture the reality in his obsession with all of the details of the moment in time. That same sort of obsession with capturing the reality of a moment in time is something that we will see with French Impressionism. And in fact, we know that a number of the Impressionists were very much aware of the work of Constable and even Turner, as we'll see. The Hay Wain was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1821. It was called Landscape Noon. Again, the idea of painting a landscape that's not a kind of in a universal time and space and weather would have seemed very strange, right? Because a classical academic landscape has kind of a universal time and space and to it. But here we have the quality of light and color and shadow that for Constable were specific to that time of day, to noon. It's, again, a charming description of an aspect of English farm life on here. A wain is a wagon, so it's a hay wagon that is fording a stream, making its way across the stream. And there's some wonderful details, such as a dog right here, that same sort of black and white dog we see in so many of his paintings, that you can just imagine is yapping like crazy and running back and forth, right, along where the water comes down just to the edge of the land. In carrying out this painting, Constable actually invented a stylistic technique that it's very difficult with 2012 eyes to even be at all, I suppose, impressed by it. So I'll tell you about it. But at the time, the English critics noticed it, as did the French critics and French painters, because Constable used a very free kind of brushwork with broken individual brush strokes. He didn't blend. He would not, someone like Ingres or David would have said, do not let your brush strokes show. Blend them together. This is not something that Constable did. So there's a kind of sprinkling of color and a freedom of brushstroke that creates a greater sense of movement in his work. He also knew that there was no color that could give the effect of that flash of light that you get when sunlight just for a moment flashes across little droplets of water on leaves. It can be almost blinding if you look at it just in a certain way. So he developed a technique of using white lead pigment, and he would make little pinpoint dots on his foliage. The critics noticed these right away. I know you can't really see them, or perhaps they don't bother you, but the critics said this is snow effect. So, in other words, they're making fun of him, that suddenly the English countryside is covered with snow. Théodore Géricault was in London at the time that this painting was exhibited in 1821, and he returned to Paris and was talking about Constable and how he had this technique of breaking up his brush strokes. The Haywain holds a crucial spot also in French Romantic painting because it was sent to Paris 3 years after it was exhibited in London. In 1824, it was exhibited at the Salon in Paris. And at that time, Eugène Delacroix saw it, and it is actually reported that Delacroix took down the work that he had submitted to the Salon of 1824 in order to work on it and repaint it based on the kind of visual impression that Constable's work had made on him, particularly the broken brushwork and these independent strokes of color. The reworked painting of Delacroix, The Massacre at Chios. Constable had married in 1816 after a 7-year courtship because he had no money to be married and have a family. His wife died of tuberculosis after giving birth to 7 children. Constable was shattered, and many of his late works are very dark and, again, highly romantic. This is an extraordinary watercolor from around 1836, the year before he died. This, of course, shows a very famous prehistoric site on the Salisbury Plain in England. This is Stonehenge. Constable lectured to classes at the Royal Academy in his later years, and he would make the same 3 points over and over again. He said, landscape painting is scientific as well as poetic. Again, landscape painting is scientific as well as poetic. Interestingly, as a romantic, he also said, the imagination alone can never produce works that stand by comparison with reality. All right, so he's saying, look at nature. Imagination alone can never produce works that stand by comparison with reality. And finally, no great painter was ever self-taught. Be the patient pupil of nature. No great painter was ever self-taught. Be the patient pupil of nature. I'm going to turn now to the other great landscape painter, English landscape painter of the 19th century, and that's J.M.W. Turner, Joseph Mallord William Turner. A contemporary of Constable, born in 1775, died in 1851. And this is a self-portrait of Turner from 1799. I'm going to tell you something now about these two artists that is considered to be a basic distinction between their works. So you need to know this. If you know anything about these two English Romantic painters, these two contemporaries, basically are vying for critical celebration in the 19th century. Constable is called the Romantic Naturalist. Turner is called the Romantic Abstractionist. Again, Constable, the Romantic Naturalist. Turner, the Romantic Abstractionist. What do you think that means? What are we talking about here? Yeah.
Constable goes for realism?
Constable goes for realism, even though, he was criticized for aspects of his painting that didn't go along with the academic tradition of landscape painting. He's really closer to a realistic painter, which would be a more conservative approach. On the other hand, I'm calling Turner a romantic abstractionist, and abstraction, of course, is removed from realism. It's highly subjective. And you would think that anyone who's moving toward abstraction is going to, in a sense, be told that they're moving in the wrong direction, that, whatever is evolving in terms of their style has to move back into a more conservative approach. But Turner's progress from romantic realism, which he seems to have started out as, to romantic abstraction is absolutely fascinating. It's almost as though he fooled everyone, and then he did exactly what he wanted to do. That he got into the club, and once he's a member of the club, what are they going to say to him? Constable's art then remains representational, despite the snow, some of the abstract elements, while Turner's art, by his mature years, is based in a almost total reduction of natural elements in nature and in a landscape with an emphasis on abstraction. There are some Turners at the Tate, which is a large museum in London, that you look at it and you would swear it was painted yesterday. There is no way that someone who lived in the 19th century could have painted this work. So, with that little introduction, you want to have a look at Turner? Yeah. J.M.W. Turner was granted a probationary term in the Royal Academy School as a prodigy at the age of 14. That's 1789. Within a year, which means he was 15, he was a full-fledged student and exhibiting his first work, a watercolor landscape, at the Royal Academy exhibition. This is not the exact landscape, but it's a landscape from approximately that period of time. This is 1791. Watercolor was a very popular medium in England and in the continental Europe in the 19th century. It was actually referred to in continental Europe as l'art anglais, the English art. So who's the great, the member of the royal family who's a lover and a artist who paints in watercolor? Really? So the heir to the throne, Charles, is a watercolorist. Yes, Prince Charles is a watercolorist. So it's still something that's very much beloved in England. And probably because watercolor seems to be so unusually well suited for a climate where everything looks wet all the time because it's always raining and everything is soft and misty, and watercolor seems to work well for that kind of representation. In 1799, Turner was invited by Lord Elgin, E-L-G-I-N, recently appointed English envoy to the Ottoman Turkish Empire, to come with Elgin to Greece, then under Ottoman Turkish control, and to sketch and to draw. Ultimately, Turner declined the offer, not because he didn't really want to go. He would have been very interested, but the monetary offer was not enough for him to leave England. Subsequently, that was again 1799. What did Lord Elgin bring back from Greece? What did he bring back? That the Greeks want returned. You heard of this controversy? Really? The Elgin marbles, as they are called, the sculptures from the Parthenon. Because Lord Elgin was given permission by the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which was controlling Greek heritage and didn't care much about Greek heritage, and he was given permission to take what he wanted from the Acropolis. And he took what he wanted, and he had it packed up and shipped back to England. And today in the British Museum, there is an entire section, and it's called the Elgin Marbles. And so this is a confluence here of that moment in time, and Turner did not go with Lord Elgin. But in the same year, in 1799, Turner became an associate of the Royal Academy at the youngest possible age, 24, and a full academician 4 years later in 1802. Now, there was already some discussion of what were viewed as new developments in his landscape painting, but it was mostly considered very positive, that his eye was becoming more discriminating. And I think you can see what we're looking at here in this watercolor work of 1791 is someone who is completely comfortable with perspective, with value contrast, with the painting of architecture, the painting of natural elements, the representation of the figure. It's a work that indicates certainly someone who has been very well trained in the tradition. In 1800, Turner painted his first historical painting. Turner is very much aware that to be considered a serious painter in the kind of hierarchy that is becoming universal, that he wants to paint an historical work. This is a subject from the Bible, the struggle of the Hebrews to be freed of the bondage in Egypt. And this is called the fifth plague of Egypt. The episode is from the book of Exodus in chapter 9, in which there is reference to all of the deadly diseases and plagues that are sent on Pharaoh's head because he will not let the Hebrews go. And this specific fifth plague is the plague of blight, B-L-I-G-H-T, a deadly disease that was sent, according to tradition, by God through the Egyptian herds, killing horses, asses, oxen, and sheep. What was the final plague that was sent that finally convinced the Pharaoh that he'd better let the Hebrews go?
Angel of death.
The angel of death. The child, the firstborn child who would die, was sent to every door. So what we're seeing here, yes, is a representation of what is considered appropriate subject matter for history painting. This is from the Bible. But in fact, as we know, Turner sees himself very much as a landscape painter, and this is very much a landscape with ancillary elements to give it an historical take. The meaning of the work may well be understood as a commentary on the Napoleonic Wars, because, of course, the French army had gone into Egypt, had been besieged in 1799 by terrible climatic conditions, including terrible sandstorms, assaults from the English and the Turks. The plague finally hit the French army. It seemed almost as if this was a revisitation of this chapter in the Bible from Exodus. And so there is perhaps specific historical context here in terms of Turner choosing this subject. Turner loves the sky. We see an incredible storm of a type that one could probably see in the English countryside. I'm not sure one would ever see this type of storm in Egypt, which has a fairly clement climate. But in any way, for Turner, what he is showing us is, again, that very romantic approach to creating kind of sublime interpretation, the violence of the scene, the violence of nature. Now, unlike Constable, whom I told you did his traveling in a very narrow region of England, Turner traveled often and wide. After 1802, when peace was concluded between the French and the English, he traveled to France. He went to Paris to study art in the Louvre. And he was particularly interested in the use of color by the Venetian Renaissance painter Titian, Titian. He went on to Switzerland for several months. He had never seen mountains like the Alps, and that would be an impression on him. These experiences would provide inspiration for later works. By 1804, Turner opened his own gallery in London. Can you imagine? What? What do you mean your own gallery? Well, he opened his own gallery. 1804. This was almost unprecedented. He made a very good living from selling his works at high prices. So you can see another artist's representation of Turner's gallery on the left from 1852. And then one of the works that was exhibited and described as being in Turner's gallery, The Shipwreck here, 1807, which is interesting in terms of our having looked already at shipwrecks, 1817. We've talked about Jericho. I also wanted to show you that there's a wonderful website at the Tate. That has a 3D recreation of Turner's gallery in London. And you literally can click and drag around. You can click on a painting that we know hung in the gallery, and you can find out more information about it. So you can see it gives you specific information about the work. Yes?
I saw that there were some paintings on the ground, like they do against the wall. Would they really do that?
Yes, they would really do that. You see them here? So they are here down along the wall. So there's just not enough wall space. They could pick it up if it's a smaller painting and show it. They could take another painting down and hang it up for someone who's perhaps interested in buying it. The Tate has a fantastic website. So. Turner's increasing success in selling his work in his own gallery meant that he could skip exhibiting at the Royal Academy exhibition if he chose to. And what he is affirming for us very early on in the 19th century is that artists who were very fearful of showing their works outside of the academic tradition of the salon could find success. They would not be ostracized completely, and this, of course, is important. So, I hope that you're starting to see a very dramatic kind of transformation in terms of landscape naturalism and landscape realism with Turner. His choice of subject matter for his paintings was always dictated by what was considered appropriate. That is, of course, for history paintings, classical subjects, Roman, Greek tradition, the Bible. His sketchbooks contain titles of possible subjects that could fit in a landscape. So we'll legitimize it, but predominantly what we're painting is not so much a history painting as a landscape history painting, or landscape history painting. History submerged in a landscape. And that's what you have here. This painting is called, as you can see, Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. 1812 is the date. It's a good-sized work. It's over 7 feet 9 inches wide, about 4 feet 9 inches in height. Hannibal was a Carthaginian general, a North African general from Carthage. He fought against the Romans at the time of the Roman Republic in the 2nd century BCE. He is probably most famous for his invasion of Italy, but he didn't come in from North Africa through Sicily and go north. What did he do? Remember what Hannibal did from your history classes? How did he enter Italy? He came around from the back. He came down through the Alps, down from the north, which no one expected him to do. The meaning, again, of the choice of this particular subject by Turner may relate to British anxieties over a possible Napoleonic invasion of England. Where would that come from? How would that work? It would have to come across the water, but where exactly would it happen? This painting would justify Turner's claim to the rank of history painter, even though, I don't know about you, but for me, this is a landscape painting. The historical narrative, of course, is important. It's carefully arranged here. And the landscape itself is carefully arranged. There's a foreground, there's a middle ground, there's a background. But it seems as though all of the other rules of landscape painting, and particularly the classical arrangement, have been defied here. Turner has invented a new compositional type to achieve dramatic effect within a traditional foreground, middle ground, and background. He's actually invented what is known as the vortex painting, a circular vortex considered to be the first example of this kind of composition in his art, but one which he would use again and again. What's a vortex? What's a vortex? Okay, then someone has to Google it, as I want someone to tell us. Vortex. V-O-R-T-E-X. Who's looking it up for me? So I don't wait around. Why do we always make the same man work so hard? Go ahead. Got it?
A massive whirling fluid or air, especially a whirlpool or whirlwind.
Okay, and you tell me what you got, nice and loud.
A spinning, often turbulent flow of fluid.
Louder.
A spinning, often turbulent flow of fluid.
Okay. So excellent. Two very good definitions of vortex. So do you see it here? Literally, it spins around sort of like a tornado, and it pulls you into the painting. Have we ever seen a composition like this before? No. This is extraordinarily original. Created by a number of sort of irregular intersecting arcs that he uses, particularly dominating the sky. The center of the clouds and the mist pull our eye into the distance, but the storm is what we're looking at, because we as viewers appear to be here among members of this army that's being routed, trying to defend from Hannibal's invasion. And we're concerned from our position that we're going to be swallowed up by this vortex of nature, which literally does look like fluid. It looks like water more than just water vapor. So the title of this painting is Snowstorm, Hannibal and his army crossing the Alps. Where is Hannibal? Find Hannibal. What's that children's game where you have to find that?
Waldo.
Where's Waldo? Where's Waldo? Where's Hannibal? When you think you see him, I'm going to let you point to him. Well, we need to start somewhere, so someone be wrong, but at least let's start somewhere. Okay. So press the top of the gray button and show us where Hannibal is. Okay, so an aggressive-looking figure who looks like he's killing some individuals. That's a possibility, right? Foreground. There's a lot of light behind him. No, you're wrong. Okay, top of the gray. Aha! A figure who's standing as though he's holding his arms up in triumph. Strong contrast, dark against light. No, you're wrong. Looks like somebody. Excuse me. The top of the green button. Oh my, that's so wonderful. You're thinking symbolically. So Hannibal is not really here. He is symbolically represented by this storm that's sweeping down into Italy. No, you're wrong. This is sort of fun. Okay, fun. Every class that I've ever taught this painting to has eventually found Hannibal.
Is he that little shape on the horizon, the little shadow?
So who wants to show us? Where's Hannibal?
Right there? Is that him? Is that a person?
What did Hannibal cross the Alps with? What did he use? Elephants. That is an elephant. And that is Hannibal. It's hard to tell. Thank you, everyone, for being such good sports. Yes, that is Hannibal. The painting was sent in to the Royal Academy exhibition as a lay-in. A lay-in was another name for an unfinished painting. But it had to be hung. It had to be officially there in order for it to be part of the exhibition. It was hung, but it was not completed because there was an official varnishing day before the exhibition opened to the public, and painters were allowed to come in and finish their works by applying varnish. It was called Varnishing Day, not Finish Your Painting Day, Varnishing Day. But Turner was notorious for completing the painting by adding oil glazes, impasto, which is a thick application of paint to give texture to the surface. He used colored waxes and resins, and he also used what is called scumbling. Scumbling refers to the use of thinly applied opaque color instead of transparent glaze colors, and it's done over a coat of paint that's just about dry to the touch, but actually it's a re-dabbing all over, putting on another layer of color. And in fact, the surface of the snowstorm, Hannibal crossing the Alps, is a riot of heavy brushwork, glazes, and scumbling. Turner was also known to have loved the color yellow. So here's a cartoon that they show of him with his paintbrush and applying some color. We have a description of Turner coming in to finish one of his paintings the day before the opening of the exhibition, and I want to read it to you because it's absolutely fascinating. The managers knew that a picture would be sent and would not have hesitated, knowing to whom it belonged, to have received and hung up a bare canvas than that which was little better. Such a magician performing his incantations in public was an object of interest and attraction. Eddie, this is another painter, Eddie was working at his side, and every now and then a word and a quiet laugh emanated and passed between the two great painters. Eddie stepped back every now and then to look at the effect of his picture, lolling his head from one side to the other, half closing his eyes, and sometimes speaking to someone near him, after the approved manner of painters. But not so much Turner. For 3 hours that I was there, and I understand it had been the same since he began in early morning, he never ceased to work, or even look or turn around from the wall on which the painting hung. All lookers on were amused by the figure Turner exhibited in himself and the process he was pursuing with his picture. A box of colors, a few small brushes, a vial or two were at his feet, very inconveniently placed, but his short figure stooping enabled him to reach what he wanted very readily. Leaning forward and sideways, over to the right, to the left hand, metal button of his blue coat rose 6 inches higher than the right, his head buried in his shoulders and held down, presented an aspect curious to all beholders, who whispered their remarks to each other and quietly laughed to themselves. In one part of the mysterious proceedings, Turner, who worked almost entirely with his palette knife, was observed to be rolling and spreading a lump of some half-transparent stuff over his picture, the size of a finger in thickness. As Callicott was looking on, I ventured to say to him, "What is it that he is plastering his picture with?" To which inquiry was replied, "I should be very sorry to be the man to ask him." Presently the work was finished. Turner gathered his tools together, put them, shut up the box, and then, with his face still turned to the wall and at the same distance from the painting, went sidelong off without speaking a word to anyone. He came to the staircase in the center of the room. He hurried down as fast as he could. All looked with a half-wondering smile, and Maclise, who stood nearby, remarked, "There, that's masterly. He doesn't even stop to look at his work. He knows it's done, and he's off." Okay.